August 2nd, 1990, the world woke up to a tremor that would shake the sands of the Middle East and rattle the pillars of global diplomacy. In the dead of night, under the cover of radio silence and darkness, Saddam Hussein's army surged across the Kuwaiti border like a serpent in the desert, swift, silent, and merciless. The invasion was over in a matter of hours, but what followed would erupt into one of the most devastating military operations since World War II. August 2, 1990. The pre-dawn stillness over Sheikh Saad border post shatters as Iraqi T-54 tanks surge through the Kuwaiti checkpoint. In minutes, the horizon floods with armored divisions under camouflage netting. A nation's sovereignty vanishes in hours. In Kuwait City, terrified citizens stream from the streets. Unbeknown to them, the oil-rich emirate is about to become the epicenter of global conflict. News spreads like wildfire. International agencies confirm Saddam Hussein, citing debts and accusations of exploitation, has ordered a full invasion. Broadcasts in Baghdad frame it as liberation. In reality, it is naked aggression. The Al-Sabah royal family flees, government buildings go dark, and manpower disappears into the desert. By nightfall, key installations, oil terminals, military barracks, government headquarters are occupied. The world watches, stunned and silent. Political analysts scramble to parse the implications. In capitals around the globe, advisors rush to issue condemnations. But as diplomats convene at the UN, bodies of strategy and politics take shape behind closed doors. In Baghdad, victory parades and televised declarations extol the new liberation of Kuwaiti people. In London, Paris, Washington, shock gives way to resolve. Global order has been challenged and no one dares look away. Kuwait, peaceful, economically stable, diplomatically moderate. But across the sand dunes, a slumbering giant, Saddam's Iraq, sees it as a target. Driven by depleted coffers after war with Iran, inflated national pride, and mounting debts owed by oil sales, Saddam's regime calculates this bold takeover will shift the balance of power in his favor. Still, few anticipated not just a minor skirmish, but a full-scale occupation. On the ground, Iraqi forces display tactical coordination. Recon drones buzz overhead. Special forces deploy to overthrow critical communications infrastructure. Iraqi infantry, followed by armored columns, advance in lockstep. Mines get laid, roads blocked, Kuwaiti resistance fractured. Civilian life implodes, currency resets, passports are confiscated, protesters vanish, fears grip tightens. Meanwhile, the international response begins. The United Nations Security Council convenes emergency sessions. Resolutions condemn the invasion unanimously, demanding total Iraqi withdrawal, setting a UN deadline. Economic sanctions roll out, oil embargoes, banking freezes, UN inspectors rush to assess humanitarian needs. The coalition of future combatants takes shape in Seoul and Addis Ababa, as well as Western capitals. Amid the chaos, scattered stories emerge. An oil executive hiding in his underground parking garage, a family fleeing by boat across the Gulf to Bahrain, Kuwaiti resistance fighters using antiquated weapons to slow Iraqi patrols in Jaber. In hushed whispers, word spreads of massacres in remote villages. Satellite imagery begins capturing the expanding occupation, public squares blocked, military vehicles lined up on Kuwait's coast. Politically, Saddam doubles down. In a televised address, he claims he is reclaiming Kuwait from colonial vestiges and economic exploitation. His rhetoric is bold, many believe it is bluff, but one that the world cannot ignore. Meanwhile, diplomats scramble to build a united front. Economic sanctions, media exposure, and military deterrence all become part of the emerging strategy. This is not a brief incursion. Kuwait's annexation as Iraq's 19th province becomes official state policy. On the streets of Kuwait City, Iraqi flags are hoisted amid broken skylines and silent mosques, but resistance lurks in whispers. Exiled leaders vow return, foreign embassies plead evacuation. Each passing hour tightens the noose, not around Kuwait, but around the voices of international intervention. In the glare of that first day, global stakes crystallize. Rights once taken for granted, sovereignty, safety, national pride, are crushed. Neighbors brace for fallout, oil markets tremble, military analysts warn of a crisis that could reshape alliances. Kuwait goes dark, the chessboard is set. Move by move, the first chapter of Desert Storm is written in the dust of invasion, and the clock toward war has begun its inexorable tick. While Kuwait fell under occupation, the gears of global response began grinding into motion. Within hours of the invasion, urgent red alert cables pinged across satellite relays from Middle Eastern capitals to Washington, London, Riyadh, and beyond. Yet, despite the speed of communication, decision-making was a race against a ruthless clock. Every passing day saw Saddam's grip over Kuwait solidify. But the real question haunting war rooms was far more dangerous. Would Iraq stop here? In Riyadh, Saudi Arabia's monarch, staunch, calculated, and deeply uneasy, realized it was next. A chilling calculation began to emerge, with Saddam's forces now on their border and the Iraqi army boasting nearly 1 million soldiers. Would the oil fields of the kingdom be his next conquest? If Saudi Arabia fell, the balance of global energy would shatter, oil prices spiked, financial markets staggered. Washington knew the world couldn't afford hesitation. President George H.W. Bush faced the defining moment of his presidency. His measured, unflappable demeanor masked the urgency behind the scenes. The U.S. began rapidly forming a military shield, what would become Operation Desert Shield. But before troops landed, before tanks crossed any border, diplomacy was put to the test. Could Iraq be turned back without a single shot? The United Nations moved swiftly by their standards. Resolution after resolution passed, demanding Iraq's unconditional withdrawal. Economic sanctions swept through, isolating Baghdad financially. Still, Saddam stood defiant. He calculated, perhaps rightly at first, that the world lacked the will for war. He had weathered the brutal Iran-Iraq war. He believed time was his weapon, but time was also a fuse. Behind the curtains of public diplomacy, the United States began building the largest military coalition since World War II. Dozens of nations joined Arab allies like Egypt and Syria, NATO members, and unexpected partners like Argentina and Bangladesh. A military apparatus, international in scale and scope, began pouring into Saudi Arabia under U.S. command. Equipment, aircraft, intelligence systems, all mobilized in secret. What the world saw were press briefings. What it didn't see were fuel depots carved into the desert, mobile command centers blinking to life, and war games rehearsed under the searing Arabian sun. In Iraq, Saddam dug in deeper. He dismissed resolutions as imperialist propaganda. He sent more troops into Kuwait. Worse, he began taking foreign nationals hostage, placing them at military installations as human shields. It was a brazen, horrifying gamble. Families abroad watched helplessly, their loved ones trapped as pawns in a dictator's game. As global networks like CNN brought 24/7 coverage to living rooms worldwide, the crisis became personal. The Gulf War, even before it began, was already a media war. Images of burning Kuwaiti oil fields, of terrified refugees, of speeches at the UN, and of American soldiers in desert camouflage flooded the airwaves. Fear turned into fury. Polls showed rising support for intervention, but the buildup was not just military, it was psychological. The United States and its allies knew that precision warfare would require more than just firepower. Satellite intelligence from newly launched spy systems tracked troop movements with startling accuracy. Night vision optics, GPS-guided munitions, laser targeting systems, all refined from Cold War strategy, were now tested, deployed, and locked in. Back in Iraq, Saddam calculated his final plays. He issued televised threats against Israel. He promised to turn the desert into a graveyard. And then, with eerie calm, he began reinforcing the Kuwaiti shoreline, digging trenches, installing bunkers, laying dense minefields. Iraqi troops filled schools, banks, and homes. Every street corner in Kuwait City became a sniper's nest or an explosives trap. The world stood in a prolonged pause. Would Saddam blink before the deadline? Would the coalition risk war in a volatile region just a few years after Vietnam? Or was a storm already inevitable? For every hour that ticked by, the scale of confrontation grew. Thousands of armored vehicles crossed into Saudi Arabia. Aircraft carriers patrolled the Persian Gulf. Troops from every corner of the globe trained in the furnace of the desert. Intelligence services scrambled to intercept Iraqi plans. Meanwhile, civilians, Kuwaitis, Saudis, Americans waited in quiet dread. Gas masks were issued. Scud missile drills became routine. The front was no longer just geographical. It was psychological, spiritual, human. The world hoped for peace, but prepared for war. And in Baghdad, Saddam watched, calculating his odds, misjudging the unity of the world, and mistaking silence for hesitation. What he didn't realize was that the storm was already gathering, and it would come with a fury he could not imagine. As Iraqi tanks rumbled deeper into Kuwaiti soil and foreign embassies scrambled for evacuations, another operation was quietly taking shape. It wasn't a strike, not yet. It was a shield, a silent, steel-clad promise that the sands of Saudi Arabia would not fall. It began with whispers, then convoys, then aircraft, until an entire war machine had embedded itself on the Arabian Peninsula. Operation Desert Shield had begun, and though no shots were fired yet, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The world stood at the edge of something vast and irreversible. The first American boots hit Saudi soil in mid-August, just days after the invasion. C-141 transport planes thundered into Dhahran and Riyadh, unloading pallets of ammunition, heavy vehicles, and uniformed troops who had never seen the kind of heat that turned daylight into a shimmering mirage. Their mission was clear but narrow: defend Saudi Arabia, not attack, not yet. The rules were strict. The posture was defensive, but no one really believed that would last. The Saudis, cautious but resolute, allowed the deployment with quiet determination. Their cities suddenly became fortified zones, and highways once used by pilgrims and traders were now lines of military traffic. The kingdom's oil facilities, some of the most valuable on earth, were reinforced with layers of air defense systems and elite guard units. War had not yet arrived, but everyone felt it lurking beyond the dunes. General H. Norman Schwarzkopf took command of coalition forces. Broad-shouldered, gruff, and battle-tested, he became the architect of the unfolding campaign. His headquarters, a sprawling network of underground bunkers and mobile command vehicles, began crafting strategies for every possible scenario, holding the line, repelling an Iraqi attack, or launching a full-scale liberation of Kuwait. The calculus was brutal, and it required absolute secrecy. Coalition forces swelled, over 500 U.S. Troops would eventually arrive alongside soldiers from Britain, France, Canada, Egypt, Syria, and dozens more. Some came with tanks, others with fighter jets. Some brought specialized chemical weapons units, fearing Saddam's possible use of gas. Intelligence briefings were frequent and grim. Scud missile launches were anticipated. Biological threats couldn't be ruled out. And always there was the looming specter of the Republican Guard, Saddam's elite force, ruthless and experienced, entrenched just across the Kuwaiti border. For the soldiers on the ground, the waiting became its own kind of warfare. Days dragged into weeks. Barracks tents baked under the sun. Camouflage netting flapped over artillery shells and fuel drums. In the stillness, small details became enormous. A cough during a sandstorm, the metallic click of a rifle being cleaned, the flicker of a distant radar screen. The buildup was relentless. the patience required inhuman, and still Saddam refused to yield. Every intelligence update painted the same picture: Iraqi troops digging in, laying booby traps, fortifying bunkers. Thousands of tanks, miles of barbed wire, oil wells rigged to blow. The entire Kuwaiti coastline had become a militarized death trap. It was clear that if war began, it would not be clean or swift. It would be scorched earth. To prepare for every eventuality, Desert Shield evolved. Engineers constructed mock-up Iraqi towns in the desert for training. Drone surveillance mapped out enemy positions with brutal precision. Satellite imagery tracked every convoy entering Kuwait. At sea, carrier strike groups maneuvered relentlessly. In the air, squadrons of F-15s, F-16s, and stealth fighters rehearsed complex combat formations. At night, special forces tested infiltration routes under blackout conditions. The media played its own part in this growing tension. Embedded journalists documented life on the front lines: sand, covered MRE, letters from home, and impromptu chapel services beside loaded tanks. News anchors speculated daily on whether Saddam would launch an attack. Some experts warned of another Vietnam. Others argued that the U.S. was finally ready for a war on its own terms, with satellite coordination, smart bombs, and lightning-fast tactics. All agreed on one thing: this wasn't just a regional dispute anymore. It was a global proving ground. As the UN issued its final deadline January 15, 1991, the sands of Saudi Arabia braced for eruption. The troops knew it, the generals knew it, even the civilians felt it in the air, as if the desert itself had stopped breathing. Operation Desert Shield was more than a shield. It was a gathering force of will, technology, and wrath. It was the tightening of a noose, a countdown without sound, a chessboard with only one move left to make. And when the final day passed and Saddam still held Kuwait in his fist, the shield would be the night of January 16, 1991, was like any other in Baghdad. Streetlights flickered above silent boulevards, families huddled inside concrete homes, waiting. Some tuned in to government broadcasts thick with propaganda. Others simply prayed. Then, at precisely 2:38 a.m., the heavens opened not with rain, but with fire. The first wave of Operation Desert Storm had begun. Without warning, a formation of F-117 Nighthawk stealth bombers emerged from the void. They slipped through Iraqi airspace, invisible to radar, carrying payloads of destruction aimed with laser precision. In mere seconds, Baghdad's skyline was shattered by thunderclaps of explosion. Television, antennas, communication towers, command bunkers all turned to rubble. The shock wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The war Saddam thought would never come had arrived in terrifying silence. Then came the second wave. Cruise missiles, launched from warships in the Persian Gulf, screamed across the dark sky, slamming into targets across Iraq with uncanny accuracy. The United States had unleashed the most sophisticated aerial bombardment in military history, and it had only just begun. Over 1,000 sorties were flown in the first 24 hours. Airfields were turned to craters. Radar installations were obliterated. Ammunition depots erupted in volcanic fireballs. Iraqi anti-aircraft batteries fired blindly into the night, their tracer rounds glowing futilely against the void. Entire neighborhoods echoed with the shrill wail of air raid sirens, punctuated by the low, concussive thud of distant detonations. The world watched it unfold live. CNN, broadcasting from a Baghdad hotel, delivered grainy green night vision footage of the bombing, explosions pulsing on the horizon like a heartbeat. The Gulf War wasn't just being fought, it was being televised. For millions across the globe, war had never felt so real, so immediate. In Washington, President George H.W. Bush addressed the nation with solemn clarity. "We will not fail," he said. "We will not waver, we will not be intimidated. In Baghdad, Saddam Hussein appeared defiant, promising a mother of all battles, yet his own command structure was unraveling. The initial assault had decapitated key military networks. Iraqi generals scrambled for alternative lines of communication. Some were dead, others unreachable. Confusion reigned. As the days turned into nights, and nights into more thunderous assaults, the air war expanded. Coalition aircraft struck targets in Mosul, Basra, Tikrit. Bridges collapsed into rivers. Oil refineries burst into flames. And always, the sky roared with engines of steel and flame. But Iraq was not defenseless. Saddam launched his counterstrike with Scud missiles. They screamed into the sky, crude and unpredictable, falling on Saudi Arabia and Israel. Panic surged. In Tel Aviv and Riyadh, civilians rushed into gas-proof shelters, fearing chemical payloads. Israel, though enraged, was urged by the U.S. to remain silent, to avoid fracturing the fragile Arab-Western alliance, and so they did. Patriot missile systems, deployed in haste, intercepted many of the Scuds. But not all. Lives were lost, fear grew, the psychological war deepened. Then came Saddam's next card, environmental warfare. Iraqi forces began setting Kuwaiti oil wells ablaze. Thick, black columns of smoke rose hundreds of feet into the sky, choking the sun. Entire landscapes turned to night. The world watched in horror as flames lit the horizon for miles. It was sabotage on a colossal scale, a warning to anyone who dared challenge him, yet the coalition remained undeterred. Day by day, Iraq's capacity to fight was eroded. Air superiority was achieved. The Republican Guard, Saddam's elite force, was pushed to its limit, defending what was left of Iraqi command centers. The skies above them now belonged entirely to the enemy. By the end of January, after nearly 3 weeks of unrelenting aerial bombardment, Iraq's infrastructure had been gutted. Electricity in many regions was gone, supply lines collapsed, morale plummeted. Thousands of Iraqi soldiers began deserting, walking through the desert with white flags or empty hands raised to the sky. But the ground war had not yet begun, and when it did, it would be swift, brutal, and historic. For now, the air campaign continued, a relentless thunderstorm of guided fury. This was not the slow, bloody trench warfare of the past. This was 21st century warfare at the dawn of its awakening. It was war with satellite vision and unmanned surveillance, laser-guided bombs, and real-time battlefield coordination. Operation Desert Storm wasn't just a military campaign. It was a spectacle, a warning, a declaration. That aggression would be answered with precision. That invasion would be repelled with overwhelming force. That the world order, though scarred, still had teeth. And so, as Baghdad smoldered and Kuwait still lay occupied, the stage was set for the final act. The storm had broken, but its eye had not yet passed. Ekam a sword, and the storm would be unleashed. February 24th, 1991, the desert wind howled across the Saudi-Kuwaiti border as dawn prepared to break. But on this morning, it wasn't nature stirring, it was an army. After 38 days of relentless airstrikes, the coalition unleashed the second and final phase of Operation Desert Storm. The ground war had begun. In a synchronized, high-speed assault, over 500,000 coalition troops surged across the dunes. Tanks roared to life, their steel treads tearing through sand and scrub. Helicopter blades thundered in formation above them. Jet fighters screamed overhead, watching like birds of prey. It was an eruption of movement, a metal tide that no defense could resist. In 4 days, history would be rewritten. The attack came from unexpected angles. While Iraqi defenses braced for a head-on assault into Kuwait, General Schwarzkopf had devised a bold, sweeping flanking maneuver, what he called the Hail Mary, U.S. and Allied forces swept westward into southern Iraq, then curved north and east behind enemy lines. It was a tactical masterpiece, a move straight from the pages of Patton or Rommel, but executed with modern speed and precision. The Iraqi front line collapsed. Resistance, when it came, was desperate and disorganized. Demoralized Iraqi troops, hungry, sleepless, and stunned by the air campaign, often surrendered without firing a shot. Some dug shallow foxholes in the sand, others emerged from their bunkers waving white cloth. Entire battalions gave up to a single tank column or air patrol. It wasn't cowardice, it was survival. Their supply lines had been cut, communications severed, and in their hearts they knew this was a fight they could not win. But not all of Saddam's forces yielded so easily. The Republican Guard, the elite, well-armed backbone of the regime, stood its ground. In the desert plains west of Basra, they dug in with Soviet tanks, artillery, and layered defenses. There, coalition forces met real resistance. Explosions shook the ground, close quarters combat flared. Apache helicopters danced through tracer fire. Abrams tanks exchanged lethal shells with Iraqi T-72s, their turrets spinning with mechanical precision. The battlefield became a hellscape of twisted metal and black smoke. Meanwhile, on the road north out of Kuwait City, another nightmare unfolded. As Iraqi troops retreated in chaos, they tried to flee north in a convoy of hundreds of vehicles, tanks, trucks, buses, civilian cars. Coalition aircraft descended upon them. What followed would become one of the most haunting images of the war, the highway of death. For miles, the road was littered with charred wreckage. Burn, doused vehicles, bodies, smoke curling into the sky. The message was clear: there would be no escape. But amidst the thunder of victory, danger never vanished. Mines littered the desert. Traps were hidden beneath what looked like ordinary sand. In some sectors, the fog of war led to friendly fire. U.S. units mistakenly engaged Allied positions. British and American troops were caught in miscommunication. Even in dominance, war remained cruel and unforgiving. Back in Kuwait, Iraqi forces unleashed a final act of spite. Before abandoning their positions, they set fire to over 600 oil wells. Flames burst into the air, thick black smoke blotting out the sun. The sky over Kuwait turned into midnight at noon. The landscape looked like something out of the apocalypse, flames roaring, ash falling like snow, the heat choking. Yet within 100 hours of the ground war's start, the tide turned completely. On February 27th, coalition troops rolled into Kuwait City. The streets were deserted, eerie and lifeless, buildings riddled with bullet holes. Flags were rehoisted. Citizens emerged cautiously, dazed but grateful. Liberation had come, and just one day later, on February 28th, President George H.W. Bush addressed the world with the words that millions were waiting for: Kuwait is liberated, the war is over. The ground campaign, swift, precise, overwhelming, had lasted only 4 days. It had destroyed Saddam's war machine in weeks, not months. It was a stunning military achievement. But beneath the celebration, the cost remained. Over 20 Iraqi soldiers lay dead or wounded. Hundreds of coalition troops had fallen. And Saddam Hussein, though beaten, still ruled from Baghdad. For the soldiers who returned home, the images would remain. The endless horizon of fire, the scorched roads, the prisoners who had no fight left in them, the buried comrades. The quiet after the storm, the world had witnessed a new kind of warfare, high-speed, high-tech, internationally unified. A statement to would-be aggressors, a warning to tyrants, but it also raised a question that echoed long after the dust had settled: if war could be so easily won, why was peace still so hard to hold? The guns had fallen silent. The smoke still clung to the skies above Kuwait like a ghost unwilling to leave. Across the desert, exhausted troops stood over conquered terrain, their mission complete. But war doesn't end with silence. It echoes, in politics, in history, in memory. The Gulf War had been swift, precise, and overwhelmingly one-sided. Yet the world would soon realize Desert Storm's aftermath was not peace, it was pause. In the days following the ceasefire, images filled television screens, American Marines greeted by cheering Kuwaitis, children waving U.S. flags, statues of Saddam defaced in quiet defiance. The coalition, basking in victory, showcased its success. The cost in human lives, on their side, had been minimal. Technology had won. Air superiority had decimated enemy positions. The Vietnam syndrome that haunted U.S. military doctrine seemed buried in the sands of Iraq, but behind the triumph lay deeper shadows. Saddam Hussein remained in power, his military crippled, his economy shattered, but his regime intact. He declared the war a moral victory, spinning propaganda of resistance and survival. Inside Iraq, brutal crackdowns began almost immediately. Uprisings by Shia Muslims in the south and Kurds in the north erupted in the wake of Iraq's defeat, believing U.S. support would follow, but it didn't. American forces, restrained by political caution and legal boundaries, did not intervene. Saddam's Republican Guard, still bloodied but functional, was unleashed upon the insurgents with brutal efficiency. Thousands were killed, entire towns were razed, helicopter gunships fired on civilians. A humanitarian disaster unfolded in real time. Refugees fled toward Iran and Turkey, seeking escape from a regime that now bled inward. For those who had hoped the war would bring regime change, the truth hit hard. Saddam had survived. The dictator who had invaded Kuwait, defied the world, and threatened Israel still sat atop the ruins of Baghdad. The coalition's aim had never been to remove him, only to expel him from Kuwait. But for many, that distinction came at too high a cost. Kuwait, meanwhile, faced its own haunting recovery. Entire city blocks had been stripped bare, infrastructure destroyed. The oil fires set by retreating Iraqi forces burned for months. Some took nearly a year to extinguish. Environmental catastrophe unfolded as smoke blocked sunlight and thickened the air with toxins. Wildlife perished. Oil slicks poisoned the Gulf. The cost of liberation was visible not only in military terms, but in ecological ruin. And then came the new battlefield, politics. The United States emerged from Desert Storm as the unrivaled superpower of the post-Cold War world. Its military dominance was undisputed. Its alliances had held firm. Its media-savvy war strategy set a precedent for conflicts to come. But questions simmered beneath the surface. Would Saddam rise again? What of the weapons he had once used in the Iran-Iraq war? Had the West defeated an army, or merely delayed another war? To contain Saddam, the United Nations imposed strict sanctions, crippling Iraq's economy. An air exclusion zone was declared. Inspectors were deployed to search for weapons of mass destruction. A long, bitter standoff began. Iraqi citizens paid the price. Poverty deepened, infrastructure crumbled, and resentment fermented like a slow poison beneath the surface of Iraqi society. In Washington, Desert Storm was hailed as a model war. Quick, decisive, relatively bloodless, at least for the coalition, it bolstered President Bush's approval ratings. It shaped a generation of military doctrine, precision warfare, real-time intelligence, media management. These would become hallmarks of modern conflict. But elsewhere, seeds were being planted. In the rubble of Iraq, extremists would rise. In the disillusionment of regional politics, new rivalries would fester. Osama bin Laden, then largely unknown to the world, cited the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia as a betrayal of Islamic Holy Land, his first major ideological spark. While Desert Storm ended a war, it quietly lit the fuse for another, one that would erupt a decade later with far greater cost. For the soldiers who returned home, the medals and parades could not erase what they had seen. The charred remains on the highway of death. The silence of empty bunkers, the realization that not all victories end in peace, and for those still in Iraq, the worst had only just begun. Desert Storm was a thunderclap in the history of warfare, a sudden, brilliant, overwhelming strike that stunned the world. But history doesn't end with lightning. It lives in the silence afterward, in the aftershock. And though the bombs had stopped falling in 1991, their echoes would stretch into the next century and beyond. Desert Storm was not just a war of tanks and missiles. It was a war of signal and silence, of precision and power, of a world stepping into the firelight of a new era. And though the guns fell silent in 1991, the echoes of that thunder still roll across the dunes today.